And this has been a very convenient theology for the stratospherically wealthy that dominate and run our country. You know, the great secret, I think, of America, certainly for me growing up, is, you know, I grew up in the myth of our benevolence. I thought this country was truly equal opportunity for everyone. I thought basically we were an equal society. You know, some people had a little more wealth than others, but they were pretty benevolent with their wealth. You know, growing up, I've learned differently. You know, when you look back at El Salvador in the 1970s, I think it was 14 families owned, what, 90% of the land? Well, in our country, the top 1% of the wealthiest 1% of this country own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Mm-hmm. And that's a suppressed story, that's a censored story, that's a story that we don't like to talk about. And, you know, to come back to the opening statements on Robertson and the news reports, that's the real agitation against Chavez. Chavez is attempting to move his society towards more justice, a greater equality, and is attempting to, for example, use the resources that they have, the oil, to benefit the poorest in his society. Will there still be filthy rich in Venezuela? Yes. Will there still be dirt poor? Yes. But what he's attempting to do is to create at least a more equal playing field. It's a heroic act. It's something that in all the traditions of America we should be behind. We should be celebrating. Chavez is actually role modeling for us some aspects of how to build a more just economy. And yet this administration, in line with the religious right, they're going after this guy. And, you know, Chavez is quite correct when he says, you know, the United States wants to assassinate me and they want to get rid of me, and we've already been involved in one coup that failed, and there is probably more to come. And so I believe that the church, and Chavez is a practicing Roman Catholic, I think the church should stand up not only against Robertson's statement, but should stand up powerfully in expressing affirmation for what Chavez is attempting to do in his own country, and also the generosity that he has been showing to nations in the Caribbean. Again, a censored, suppressed story. You know, you don't read it in the Seattle PI, you don't read it in the Seattle Times, you don't even hear it really on NPR. And so where do we get this information? You know, how can we learn to discern what is happening in our world? And so I'll stop there by saying that a crisis in the church is that in the church we are failing to discern truth, and we are being also overwhelmed, just like society is being overwhelmed by the propaganda and the lies and the deceit.
I think there's 6 or 7 media giant corporations that control 99% of what's being fed through the TV, radio, and newspapers. And so that's the same kind of consolidation of power as you were talking about in El Salvador, 14 families owning 90% of the land wealth.
Right.
And I think that Chavez, what Venezuela represents, strikes not against the apocalyptic chord of the people, the neocons in power now, but it strikes against the dominionist chord. Yeah. Because you see, Chavez dares to challenge their ownership rights of the labor and the resources of the country of Venezuela, which belongs to the land and the earth of Venezuela, that Venezuela is, you know, and the people who happen to live there, right? And I think it's there was another interesting point that you went into that I would like to kind of come back to, is the failing of the church in America. Because prior to the war, and you write about this in the book, there was an incredible outpouring of anti-war sentiment around the world. So depending on the figures who you listen to, 10 to 35 million people on one day on February 15, 2003, followed by another demonstration of nearly that proportion a month later, and then another one following that a month later, that all around the world. This is huge. And then at the same time, the churches in America, I believe over 1,000 Methodist ministers wrote, or it was either 100 or 1,000, wrote a letter to George Bush asking him not to go to war, and this was echoed by many different faiths. I mean, probably the biggest outpouring of faith against war and violence ever seen on the planet. Another thing not touched on by the media. Another incredible event on a human level, on a spiritual level, you know, just never before. Has
And
that happened?
And a failure of backbone by
So
the church.
what I see now with Camp Casey, with these military families that are coming out, some of which are very religious folk, and other folks who aren't. A lot of them are very mainstream. They believe, just as you did, that the system was benevolent, that they weren't going to be lied to by the commander-in-chief and by the government, and that any time that our armed forces would be used for defensive and benevolent purposes around the world. But that's a lie, and that's evident to some of us, and not so evident to others. But as these folks see their brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and fathers and mothers go to Iraq and put their lives at risk, now they're coming out and they're saying, hey, I would support my brother or sister or son, daughter resisting this and not going. I don't want them to go, but they feel like they have to do it because it's their job, it's their duty, and where would they go if they didn't go? But with 5,500 AWOL brothers and sisters now from the military, and potentially many thousands more in the future with Camp Casey, I see this as a phenomenal opportunity for the churches of this country to open their doors to these GIs to support their resistance and to give them sanctuary and to support their families in their times of crisis. This is not easy to do.
Right.
So I do see an incredible opportunity, even though there is this crisis. So what we talked about this a little bit before when you were here last time, about what the other people in your church felt about what was going on. And were they taking up an idea of maybe helping the resistance and sanctuary movement? And so has that changed in the last 6 weeks at all? Or
What's changed, I think by and large in the pews, if anything is changing, what is changing is, once again, the church is following trends that happen in our culture. And so our culture is moving away from celebrating this war. There's a lot of dissidence in our culture, and so that's now beginning to register in the church. But again, cheap prophecy here. 9/11 falls on Sunday, and I can guarantee you that in many churches, certainly outside of Seattle, in almost most of the churches outside of Seattle, maybe a few in Seattle, there'll be nothing said about the connections that this administration is attempting to make between 9/11 and this so-called war on terror. When I look back at the military issues facing us, the church almost unified with one voice, which is what you were saying, at the outbreak of this war in Iraq, spoke and said this is an unjust war. And so what that meant is that the church was giving guidance to its own people, to the culture as well, but certainly to Christians, saying this is not a time to pick up arms. This is not a time to cooperate with Caesar, so to speak, with government. What government is doing right now is an abomination. It is against the orders of creation. It is against the Spirit of God. But then that's all we did. And when our Christian men and women sign up for the military, and when they go off to Iraq, we bless them. And our military chaplains are still involved, blessing the war. And the church, if the church calls this war unjust, then the church should also be very bold in saying we need to stand down from this war, which now goes into what you were saying, and that is we need to open our churches, our facilities, our assets, our legal assets, to help and assist and facilitate those who signed up for the military to be able to get out of the military. We need, I think, one of the growing ministries of the church ought to be with youth, the building up of conscientious objection, training kids how to go into their high school and not simply resist the military recruiters, but to teach fellow students how to resist military recruiters. This would be, I think, a wonderful facilitating role for the church to take on throughout the country. Teaching our children to have the spiritual discernment that when war is not about self-defense, when war is about imperialism and the plunder of other people's resources, it is the moral responsibility of a nation to say no to their leaders. And that also involves training in civil disobedience.